Hello, my name is Daniel Helfand, and I'm a developer advocate with Intuit. And today in this video, I'm going to go over using Argo CD, which is a continuous delivery tool for Kubernetes, with vclusters, which is a way of hosting multiple Kubernetes clusters on a single host Kubernetes cluster. I think that the combination of Argo CD with vclusters is great because Argo CD has these great features around deploying to external Kubernetes clusters, and vclusters make it really easy to actually spin up Kubernetes clusters and simulate the experience of using Argo CD to deploy to external clusters. So to get started here, I'm going to head out to my terminal. And I already have a Kubernetes cluster set up with Argo CD. And the first thing that I'm going to go ahead and do here is that I'm going to create a vcluster using the vcluster CLI. So I can go ahead and run this vcluster create command, and I'm going to create a vcluster named vc Argo CD in the Argo CD namespace. And then the last option that I'm specifying here is the expose flag. And the expose flag basically adds an accessible endpoint for us to actually access the vcluster. So now that the vcluster has been successfully created, I can go ahead and run vcluster list. And you'll see that I have a vcluster named vc Argo CD in the Argo CD namespace, just like we expected. So the next thing that we'll need to go ahead and do in order to access and use this vcluster is that we'll need to again use the vcluster CLI to connect to our vcluster. And I'm adding on the update current option here to this command. And what that's going to do is actually add a context to my kubeconfig that will make it really easy for us to switch back and forth between using the host cluster as a context and then switching to the vcluster context. So that looks like everything has gone through successfully. And to start here, what I'm going to go ahead and do is show you all of the namespaces that I have available on my host cluster. So you notice that I have one called Argo CD, and that's where Argo CD is deployed to, and also where we just created our vcluster. Now, in order to access the vcluster, what I can go ahead and do is see what context I have available. And you'll see that in addition to my host cluster context, I have this vcluster context. So let me go ahead and select that and switch over to it. And now if I go ahead and run my kubecontrol get namespaces command again, you'll see that there is no Argo CD namespace. And also that the ages of the namespaces on our vcluster here differ from that of our host cluster. So it really has the look and feel of using a completely independent Kubernetes cluster. So the next thing that we'll want to do in order to actually integrate this with Argo CD is that we'll want to make Argo CD aware that there is this external cluster that it can deploy to. So in order to do that, we'll go ahead and use the Argo CD CLI, which has this cluster add command. And the argument that I'm passing to it is the context for our vcluster. And now it's going to prompt me and ask me if I want to create some RBAC on this vcluster, which will allow us, or will allow Argo CD to deploy resources out to the cluster. So it looks like the cluster has been added. And now if we run the Argo CD cluster list command, you'll see that in addition to the in-cluster option, which is available, which means that Argo CD can deploy to the cluster that it is deployed to, we actually have the option to deploy to this vcluster as well. So the last thing that we need to do is we need to create an application. And this application is Argo CD's way of comparing what's in your source of truth, which is a Git repository, to what's actually deployed out to your Kubernetes cluster. So in this particular case, in order to set up an application with our vcluster, what we're going to do is use the Argo CD CLI and run this app create command. We're going to create an application called guestbook. It's pointed at this GitHub repository, which has a sample application. And then the destination name here is how we specify that we want to deploy out to our vcluster. And the destination namespace is what namespace on the vcluster we want to deploy the sample application to. So I'll go ahead and create the application. And now in order to actually visualize the application, let's head out to the Argo CD UI. And you'll see that we have the guestbook application registered here, but you'll notice that the status here is that it's out of sync. So that means that what's defined in our GitHub repository differs from what is actually deployed out on our vcluster. So in order to reconcile these two, what we can do is hit the sync button and click synchronize. And now what's happening is that Argo CD has gone through this process of taking what's in the Git repository and deploying it out to the default namespace on our vcluster. And we can visualize that here. So what we should expect to see is a deployment and a service actually created on our vcluster. So to start here, I'm going to make sure that I'm using the host cluster context. And I want to actually see what's been deployed out to the default namespace on the host cluster, just to make sure that we're actually deploying to our vcluster as we expect. So I'll go ahead and run the kubectl get all command here. And you'll see that the only thing that exists in the default namespace on our host cluster is the default Kubernetes service. Now, if we go ahead and switch back to our vcluster context and run the same kubectl get all command, you'll see that we have all of the resources that we expected to be deployed out to our vcluster for our sample application. So to wrap up here, I hope that this video shows all the possibilities between using Argo CD with vclusters. I personally think that it's a great combination as far as developing Argo CD deployments to external clusters without needing to spin up additional clusters. And there may be some additional interesting opportunities around developing multi-cluster deployment scenarios with Argo CD. So thanks again for watching. And I look forward to any feedback and questions that you may have on this video.